So I feel a little bit like a David and Goliath moment, meaning that I'm the David, because I haven't been doing academic research for 7 years. So what I'm going to propose is, well, what we're about to present is our information about the model that we've built to try to collect data on the industry. Many of you have been doing research with this data or thinking deeply about the data, so this is very much an opportunity for you to contribute to the discussion. So we'll talk about the working group we formed, the collaboration we have, the data we think we're going to get in addition to the data we have, and then I'd like to get some feedback on policies and best applications of building an enclave. This is an interesting place to be because we're in an emerging industry. I was talking to Danae Ringelman a couple days ago. She's a Haas graduate, and she's a founder of Indiegogo, and she wanted me to remind everyone that crowdfunding was started here at Berkeley. The first crowdfunding platform was launched by Haas students. So I guess you're welcome home. But this has been an incredibly rapidly evolving field, literally exponential growth over the last couple of years. We have a team tracking the emergence of crowd sites, and they are popping up on a daily basis. I have a list of over 800 crowdfunding sites right now. Not all of them active and doing much, but there's hundreds of them in existence. So let's go ahead and get started. So what are we trying to accomplish? Inside the Fung Institute, we want to be the hub of data collection and aggregation, which is actually going to be both a resource and manpower intensive process, so that we can distribute information and help guide policy and also feed you data that you can use in your research. So essentially a data enclave for the use of academics and policymakers globally. And we want to track all variations on crowdfunding. This is not just crowdfund investing for equity investments for startup companies and technology industries. This will involve pledge, donation, rewards, royalty share, crowdfunding in Asia. There's variations on crowdfunding models. There's also hybridized platforms that do not cleanly fit within one particular existing model. So we're going to go through some of the data challenges that we have, and I have 2 or 3 graduate students in the room right now that are going to help them do a lot of the yeoman's efforts of building this out. So they'll be taking tons of notes as we go on. So that's the grand vision. We hope to be able to be your servants. We want to be able to provide data to all of you. There's a lot of duplication of efforts. We are also going to be having a repository of research reports and papers available on our website. There's a lot of duplication of that, and just simply by aggregating that information, if you have white papers or publications or things that you would like to share with the global research community on crowdfunding, please send them to us, and we'll be happy to centralize that distribution point. So what are the steps and processes that we're going to follow? The first thing is, over the last 48 hours, we have actually formed an initial working group of crowdfunding leaders, most of whom are also academics, and we have a meeting actually in 2 weeks in London. We'll all be in London on the 31st, and we have very near-term deliverables for this group. So we're going to release the partnership roadmap and discuss that in a moment. We're going to talk about our research goals and define those. One of the challenges we have is there's no taxonomy or standardized definitions of terms within crowdfunding. So member, investor, pledger, donor, these terms are used very loosely by different people. And when I've heard some of the papers, I've heard some semantic differences in how people are referring to different players in this ecosystem. So we are going to throw out there an initial taxonomy and ask you all to contribute your ideas on improving it. And it's going to be a difficult process. So we also are going to try to define, and we're working with a couple of attorneys, what does fraud actually mean? That's a very hairy question. And there's some very interesting boundary distinctions between outright fraud, criminal intent, misappropriation, miscommunication, misrepresentation. So we're going to, as part of our taxonomy, try to define crowdfunding fraud. And we'll be working with some of the law faculty to help us in that, of course. We're then going to look at how do we build cooperation mechanisms to incentivize the platform. Some platforms are willing to share data, and we have some data. The good news is there is data here at Berkeley, but we need to get more. And we're looking at some of the psychology and motivational structure for platforms to share data with us. So if any of you have particular experience or insights into the best ways of doing that, and or a couple of you have managed to get these platforms to already cooperate with you, the question is that a relationship you're willing to share with other researchers, or can you share that data? I understand sometimes you build a career on having exclusive access to data, but if there are opportunities for sharing accesses that you already have, please let us know, and we'll share it with the global community. Lastly, we're going to build a technical infrastructure, and I'll be going into that proposed technical infrastructure in a few minutes for how we're actually going to go about collecting some of this. And then we are going to be producing some reports, and by industry reports, I'm not meaning peer-reviewed academic journals. I'm meaning literally sort of snapshot monthly or quarterly updates on the status of crowdfunding, probably on our website, which will be updated with some visualizations and infographics, so you can drill down. Very similar to, but not exactly like the Open Data Initiative in Britain that was done around peer-to-peer lending models. But this is too rapidly evolving to wait for a yearly publication. We're thinking probably a quarterly update to what we know, and we'll put that on our website. We'd like to have an opportunity to give the platform some feedback, so we'll anonymize the data and then provide some benchmarking data that they can use for evaluating where they are compared to their peers. And we have to think very deeply about how we do that in such a way as to not disclose competitive intelligence, which will disincentivize anyone with sharing data with us. We'll also be doing a little bit of policy data reporting. I'm not a policy expert, and I don't think it's the business of an academic to be providing necessarily policy guidance, but we are already receiving calls from government agencies and officials asking what data we have and can we answer specific questions. So one of the explicit objectives of this center is to aggregate data for the use of policymakers and to disseminate that information to policymakers, SEC, government, Senate Banking Finance Committee, White House, British Parliament, European Commission, and others. And then lastly, we've been asked by one particular person if it's possible to actually have a reviewed objective tracking measure for the incidence or non-incidence of fraud in crowdfunding. There's one body of opinion that fraud does not exist. There's one body of opinion that fraud will be rampant. There's very little data that suggests that fraud does exist, but we don't necessarily know that absence of evidence is evidence of absence. So we need to do some more digging there and determine that. Many of the platforms also have fraud detection algorithms that they're using and screening out before the campaigns are allowed to go live. So we're going to try to work with the platforms to get access to that layer of pre-posting fraud detection, or flagging is probably a better term because we don't actually know if fraud would or could have occurred. We just know there's some signals that make the site suspicious. And so what data are they using and how is that being determined? Then we have had a couple of other suggestions in looking at insurance claims and actual legal filings. So we're trying to think through some of the difficulties around reporting on fraud, but we know that the incidence rate is substantially low. I personally know of 2 confirmed incidences of fraud in crowdfunding worldwide. And I've spoken to many of the international platforms, and they say that the base rate is essentially 0. But I'd like to have an academic and rigorous method for proving that, as opposed to just relying on assertions. So we are bucketizing crowdfunding for initial purposes only into 3 categories. Pledge and rewards we're lumping together, and I realize there's some differences. We're looking at equity, and we're looking at debt models. So ASSOB Australia has agreed to share all of their data historically and prospectively with us, and that relationship exists. We have all historical Kickstarter data today. We already have got Kickstarter data that we can work with. We're getting data from a couple of the other larger platforms. That's the least interesting part of this. Part of what we've been doing is working with the crowdfunding associations, many of the leaders of whom are here today. Many of them already have existing relationships with these crowdfunding platforms, and they are sharing some level of details, oftentimes very macro level, trending level, as opposed to the granular transactional data that we'd like to see. What we're going to try to get through these relationships with the associations, where they're the friends, colleagues, drinking buddies with these platform providers, to incentivize them to share their data with us. Some of that will be done through surveys, some of that will be done through APIs, some of that will be done through existing reporting mechanisms where the associations then share that data with us. There will not be one standardized methodology because there's no possible political way we can force one model on all these platforms. But with the agreements in place, we have access to probably 75% of the data coming out of Europe. We have access to a lot of the data coming out of the United Kingdom. We'll have access to the sites in the Middle East. And the Canadian Crowdfunding Association's agreed to share all the data that they're gathering. Unfortunately, not many of the US sites are wanting to share data with us at this point, which is ironic. We are working on that. The frank reality of it is that the U.S. crowdfunding professional associations, and there's 3 competing ones, are fairly dysfunctional. And they don't have strong relationships with the platforms that enable them to exert any influence to force them to give data or incentivize them to give data. So that's going to have to be done at the level of researchers or the level of relationships, not through the U.S. associations. So we have, I would say, 50 to 60% potential penetration based on the agreements of the data available in the world. And we also have been talking to several of South American countries that are here. And there are several platforms. Qatar and Brazil has agreed to share their data with us, and there's others as well. And there's some sites operating or about to launch in Colombia, Chile, Peru, and there's discussion of Mexico. So we're about to see some South American activity, and many of those organizations are already in discussion with us about sharing the data. So, conceptual problem, we're getting political agreements and not in-kind agreements, but basically they're willing to share their data with us. What do we do and how do we collect it? This is a massively complex problem. So again, the basic structure that we have in mind, and I know some information systems faculty in here, and please feel free to jump in a minute, is to collect that data using a NoSQL unstructured database, probably Mongo, probably JSON, and the reason for which is the data is very unstructured and it's a time series of data, but once the campaigns are over, move it into a relational database, and that relational database is then what we will, with whatever policy rules we put in place, make available to all of you. But the actual collection engine will be done in this unstructured database. We're looking right now at siloing it in 3, and I've had a raging debate already this morning if this is the correct data model, so please jump in a minute, is do we create 3 databases? Do we create the pledge, the equity, and the debt? Because the structure of those campaigns, the structure of the information is actually quite distinct between those. Part of the problem, though, as one of my friends reminded me this morning, is, especially in some of the European models, there's convertible natures even in the offering themselves. And there's also platforms that offer more than one model. So they offer both pledge and debt or pledge and equity existing within one series of data. So the basic model for discussion is this: 3 silos of data structured around the 3 main types of crowdfunding, collected using unstructured, being stored and archived in a relational system, and then we have to create a series of policies around verifying who has access to that data. And the initial assumption is that we will only make that data available to academics and probably a limited subset in the first few months, just so that we can scale up our processes to manage the requests. And we're going to have a very explicit verification model, and here's the problem. All the European sites get hit up 2, 3, 5 times a day from master's students in Europe saying, I'm a graduate student, I want to do my thesis on crowdfunding, will you share your data with me? Challenge is twofold. One is that it may not be high quality research, and 2, they may not really be doing research. They may be entrepreneurs that happen to be graduate students that are using that as a guise for trying to get data. So we need to figure out the series of policies that will best allow us to make the data accessible, and we're thinking of a 2-tiered structure where very macro level or industry trending level data will make available globally, and anyone can have access to that. But especially as we start getting transactional data, and especially around transactional data around debt and equity, where we have information about the investors, we'll have to very carefully protect the privacy of the information and use obfuscation and other methods to ensure that no one can get information about the individuals involved in that. So that's where we need to be very careful protecting that data. So we also, Alicia from Coffin has offered some guidance from other models that they've built, and we'll be looking forward to collaborating with them on terms of the policies around how to create this data enclave and create the best policies and best practices around access to that data. If any of you have experience building sort of this tiered access model, we'd love to have those conversations with you. So I'm not going to bother going through all of the schemas, but we have 3 distinct schemas we've built out, and I'm happy to put these up on the website, and please feel free to jump in, those of you that have a technical bent in terms of the data that we're going to be collecting. This is a schema we've built for pledging, and to simplify it, essentially it's the reward structure, the campaign details, information about the portals and the profiles of the parties. Yes, where'd you go?
How granular will the location be? Is it street address, city?
It's a level of granularity that the sites will allow us to have access to. Is the short answer to that. We're hoping to have very detailed information, but that's going to be a challenge. Many of the sites are willing to share some moderate level of granularity, but they're not willing to give us a very deep level. I think, being brutally honest, I think we're going to have a subset of sites that we're going to give us API access to all their data, but the majority of sites are not going to give us that level of granularity, at least at first. Am I going in the wrong direction? Oops. So equity becomes a little bit more complicated. We have to track information about the people, the issuers, the issue itself, the portal, the investors, and then information about the transaction or the transactions that occur. That's a much more complicated one. None of this, from data architecture is that complicated. Those of you that have been involved in big data projects, this is actually fairly trivial. The problem is every site has different definitions and structures, and the terms are used very differently in different parts of the world. So we can't impose one structure on all the sites. And so we're going to have to be fairly loose in our aggregation of all of this data. And then a schema for debt. So we have borrowers, issuers, the portals, the lenders, transaction details, loans, and then also data about repayment. So we have to track the activity. And we'll make all this available to you. So I know you can't go through a table diagram. Yes, please. I can't answer. Prosper has their schema? Yeah. Okay, I'm happy to use theirs. That will work. So, and I know Julie in the peer-to-peer lending has done some modeling as well, and we're definitely going to take advantage of their insights. So this is mostly going to be a discussion. So there's a couple of things. We have a working group around this data collection process. There's about 6 or 7 of us that have so far jumped into the fray, willing to help build this out. And the working group has 3 components. One is a technical architecture team that will actually build this database and this system, and that's going to be resident here at Cal, of course. Secondly, we have a community and outreach component, which essentially means who is going to go through the nitty-gritty hard work of reaching out to these portals and to the associations and maintaining the hundreds of relationships and applying the social pressure and the human capital to get the data out of the sites. And then there's going to be the research and policy component of what could be the outputs of it and helping frame the policies around data access.